I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss our exclusive reporting into insider Russian reaction to Operation Spider's Web. Hear from someone just on the front line in Donetsk, and relay the latest acts of resistance in the occupied territories. Plus, you'll hear Dom's panel from the Black Sea Security Forum in Odesa, featuring former British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace and former Minister of State for Security Tom Tugendhat, reflecting on key decisions made early in the war.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 20th of June, 3 years and 117 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, before Dom's panel, I'm joined by Dr. Jade McGlynn of King's College London and Memphis Barker, our senior foreign correspondent, who's just returned from Ukraine. But first, a summary of the major military and political developments of the past 24 hours. Ukraine endured another deadly night of Russian aerial assaults. Though numerically the scale was slightly less intense than other strikes this week, nevertheless casualties were reported across multiple regions. In Odesa, Russian forces launched an especially large drone strike, destroying a residential building and damaging several apartment blocks. At least one civilian was killed and 4 others injured, including 3 emergency workers. The city's historic centre, a UNESCO World Heritage Site of course, sustained extensive damage. Local residents report Odesa as being on fire overnight, and some of the images this morning of the damage are shocking to see, given Dom and I were only there a couple of weeks ago. Kharkiv too was targeted in a swarm drone attack, resulting in 4 injuries, among them 2 teenage girls. In the Dnipropetrovsk region, combined drone and artillery attacks wounded a 39-year-old man, and meanwhile continued shelling across the Kherson and Donetsk regions left 1 person dead and 17 more injured. In sum, Moscow launched 86 drones overnight, of which 34 were reportedly shot down and 36 identified as decoys, falling harmlessly or neutralised by electronic warfare. That means 19% of drones penetrated Ukrainian air defences, with direct hits recorded at 8 sites and debris causing further damage in 11 locations. The Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office calls attention to the deliberate attacks on residential targets amid growing concern that global attention has shifted onto the Middle East. Officials have now updated the casualty count from the attack on Kyiv on Tuesday to 30 confirmed dead, with 172 others injured. Now, let's turn to the ground war. On the northern front, Ukrainian forces recently advanced in Sumy Oblast, one of the areas identified by Kyiv's top commander as a key site of Russia's so-called spring offensive. Geolocated footage shows Ukrainian troops recapturing positions south of Andrivka, north of Sumy city. Russian military bloggers reported fresh clashes near settlements around that city, with Ukrainian forces reportedly counterattacking in the vicinity. In the Donetsk region, Russian forces maintained defensive operations around Pokrovsk on June 19th, but made no confirmed territorial gains. Yesterday, Dom described the unusual use of motorbikes and even golf buggies in assault tactics. So if you're interested in more detail on the specific nature of those assaults, do listen to that. Meanwhile, a revealing interview with Russian ambassador to the UK, Andrei Kelin, has drawn attention to inconsistencies in Russian military reporting. Speaking to CNN, Kelin dismissed Ukrainian claims of 1 million Russian casualties, but acknowledged that approximately 600,000 Russian troops are currently fighting in Ukraine, a figure in line with Ukrainian estimates from January. Kelin added that 50 to 60,000 new recruits are joining the war effort each month. However, he offered no explanation for why troop numbers remained stagnant despite what should have seen an additional 250 soldiers joining since January, leading the Kyiv Independent and others to speculate that this reveals the staggering losses Moscow has suffered in the last few months. Remember, according to Ukraine's general staff, Russia has lost 217,000 troops estimated since the beginning of 2025 alone. Nonetheless, evidence suggests that Russian recruitment is still able to outpace Ukraine's at the present moment. Now, on the subject of those losses, Kyiv is reporting that Russia handed over some bodies of its own soldiers to Ukraine under the guise of Ukrainian casualties during one of those recent exchanges of the dead. In total, Ukraine has received 6,057 bodies of its fallen soldiers as part of this phased exchange agreed in Istanbul. Russia, according to one Kremlin aide, has only taken back 78. One of the bodies returned to Ukraine was dressed in a Russian military uniform and carried a Russian passport issued to Alexander Bugiev, born in 1974. Alongside that passport, officials found a military ID indicating he'd served in the 1st Battalion of the 39th Separate Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade. He went missing during heavy fighting in Donetsk in March. His family have been searching for him for months. Kyiv's interior minister said Russia has located Bugiev's body, but then chose to dump it among the Ukrainian dead. This is just another proof of how Russia treats its people with contempt, he said, throwing their bodies onto the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers. It shows how little human life means to Russia, or maybe it's just a way to avoid paying compensation to the families. But they will have to pay anyway. We are returning these bodies. Now, turning to the diplomatic realm, the EU's top diplomat Kaja Kallas has reiterated her argument that failure to provide stronger military and financial support to Kyiv could leave Europe vulnerable to growing Russian influence. We know that Russia responds to strength and nothing else, she said, calling Ukraine Europe's first line of defence and emphasising the need for continued sanctions. She said, to quote my friend NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, if we don't help Ukraine further, we should all start learning Russian. That's a reference to those controversial remarks made by Rutte at the speech he gave at Chatham House I attended last week. Now, Kallas was previously Prime Minister of Estonia, of course, and in another interesting development, a coalition of EU countries is increasing pressure to bar Russian citizens who participated in the war against Ukraine from entering the Schengen area, citing serious security concerns. Interior ministers from the Baltic states, the Nordic countries and Poland met in Tallinn yesterday, where they issued a joint statement confirming their intent to prevent entry. There are hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens who fought against Ukraine, Estonia's interior minister said. We must take a clear stance. These individuals cannot freely travel across the Schengen area. The statement read this. Member states should take all necessary measures to ensure that individuals who are or have been contracted by the Russian armed forces or other armed groups acting on their behalf are not allowed to undermine our security or move freely. Quite an interesting story, that. Now, across the pond, according to Politico, officials in Washington are frustrated with the diplomatic efforts of Andriy Yermak, head of Ukraine's presidential office, and believe he may be undermining Kyiv's efforts to win favour. According to 14 people who spoke to Politico, including US and Ukrainian officials, many believe that Washington officials find Yermak abrasive and uninformed and fear he is inaccurately conveying US positions to Zelensky. During Yermak's most recent visit to Washington, he reportedly struggled to land meetings with Trump officials. One person familiar with the visit described Yermak as an existential liability for Ukraine. All the people in the US who want to withdraw and abandon Ukraine are thrilled to have Yermak around, one person told Politico. He reportedly struggled to land meetings with Trump officials, something we reported at the time. One person familiar with the visit described Yermak as an existential liability for Ukraine. In a statement to Politico, Yermak said he was doing everything in his power. If that means being considered challenging by others, so be it, he said. I will wait many more hours outside any door if that helps my country and my president's mission. I have no ambition to fully grasp how American politics works. I come to speak about the country I know best, Ukraine. Now, At the time of the Oval Office encounter between Zelensky and Trump, many privately blamed Yermak for failing to adequately prepare Zelensky for that meeting. And if you want to hear more of the cut of his jib, I interviewed him on video 6 months ago, and we'll add a link in the show notes to that. But let's end with updates relating to Russia and more details from a remarkable piece by our colleagues here at The Telegraph speaking to Russian hardliners about their attitudes towards the war. They found that anger has grown after Operation Spider's Web. Shock and outrage is how one high-ranking Russian official described the mood in the Kremlin the day after Kyiv's surprise attacks. Another Russian official told us, like every thinking patriot, I took it as a personal tragedy. The fury ran so deep in some quarters that there were renewed calls for Putin to declare war on Ukraine. As the piece says, among the hardline nationalist elite, there is growing belief that Putin has not gone far enough, that he should formally declare war, recruit 1 million more men, and wipe out Zelensky's government with daily missile strikes on Kyiv. Explosions, drones, sabotage, and possibly even terrorist attacks are what the future may hold for us if the Zelensky regime is not completely destroyed, said a current high-ranking Russian government official. He described himself as hawkish and admitted sympathising with Prigozhin. Now, reflecting on Spider's Web specifically, a former senior Kremlin official told us, the operation did not catalyse a political discussion or change the format of military operations. In the Russian power system, where inertia and preserving the current balance are essential, that speaks volumes. Another source, based in an analytics centre close to Russia's defence ministry, was even blunter. As cynical as it may sound, the leadership is satisfied with the current situation. Now, another interesting snippet in the piece is on the subject of the economy. As a reminder, the Kremlin is forecast to spend 6.3% of GDP on defence this year, which is the highest since the Cold War, but not what would be expected of a country on a full wartime footing. For comparison, Ukraine spent 34% of its GDP on defence last year. Mobilisation undermines economic stability, said one current government employee. According to him, those close to Putin are able to persuade Putin that mass mobilisation would be a step towards the war effort's collapse. And why is it needed? We have missiles, we have volunteers. Their resources are not yet exhausted, the government employee added. There are many more fascinating and rare snippets in that piece, which we'll link to in the episode description. I know other newspapers around the world have taken several quotes from it. Just a brief tangent on the Russian economy. Yesterday, at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, Russia's central bank governor suggested that Moscow's economic momentum is fading, warning it can no longer rely on the same tools that sustained growth in the first 2 years of the war. She said the economy has been expanding on the back of free resources, including labour, industrial capacity, bank capital reserves and liquid assets, all of which are now reportedly nearing depletion. We grew for 2 years at a fairly high pace because free resources were activated, she said. We need to understand that many of those resources have truly been exhausted. That aligns with warnings that many experts have said that in the next year or so, key economic pressures will come to a head, that Putin cannot sustain the war machine at its current pace without serious consequences elsewhere. As you'll know, he sought to shield the quality of life in Moscow and St. Petersburg from the strain of the war. But how long can that balancing act last? Many wonder. Some say years, some months. But those are the key updates. Let's turn now to Dr. Jade McGlynn for the latest on resistance activities in the occupied territories. Jade, always a pleasure. Welcome back. Where do you want to start?
Hello, Francis. As always, thank you for having me. I'll just dive straight in. I'll bring attention to a few of the more notable cases and then I'll go through the list as usual. So this period is between the 6th and the 18th of June 2025. And over this fortnight period, we found at least 13 confirmed actions. So in the public space, just another reminder that there's lots that we don't hear about. And even if we did hear about it, we obviously couldn't talk about it. Most of the operations during this period took part in the southern area of the temporarily occupied territories, so more occupied Zaporizhia region and occupied Kherson region. And again, we see a real focus on the sabotage of transport infrastructure. That makes lots of sense because, we've seen Russian buildups and of course we've seen the Russians sort of trying to go on various offensives with varying amounts of effort. We also saw quite a visible increase in activity from the partisan group Anti-Smersh. So I explained last time, Smersh is deaf to spies, and it's a sort of like a slogan of the sort of NKVD period during World War II in Russia. And so this is Anti-Smersh. So they're against essentially it's just anti-FSB. Anti-Smersh tend to focus on disrupting Russian military logistics in Crimea and in southern Ukraine, because Crimea is very much the gateway to southern Ukraine, especially Kherson, with which it has land borders. Small, but the land borders. I think the most notable case, though, during this period occurred on the 18th of June in the occupied city of Berdyansk in Zaporizhia region. It's maybe like an hour and a half drive along the coast from Mariupol. And here, Ukrainian resistance forces eliminated a local collaborator, Mikhailo Khrytsai, who's originally from the Poltava region. He'd lived in Berdyansk. He'd led the local branch of the Socialist Ukraine Party, which perhaps it may not come as a surprise to listeners to hear, has always essentially been staffed, sadly, with Russian agents. And after the Russian occupation began in 2022, he voluntarily joined the occupation administration, became the mayor and deputy for infrastructure, utilities and energy, which again, I don't think it would be libelous to say, given how much evidence there is, has been a rather corrupt institution in the occupied territories.
We won't tell anyone, Jade.
Okay, fine, thank you. Just between us and the listeners. But yes, he was deeply involved in looting Ukrainian state property for Russian interests. He took part in war crimes, including organizing torture sites in the city and denouncing pro-Ukrainian civilians to the occupiers. And he was actually charged in absentia with high treason by Ukrainian prosecutors back in April 2022. So just in case anybody felt a little bit sorry for him. Hopefully I've dispelled any of that. Let's move on to the case-by-case analysis, and then we can sort of go through it. June the 7th, Yelizavetivka, which is in Zaporizhia region. A lot of these places, I mean, I think plenty of Ukrainians, unless you're from the region, also wouldn't know of them, just to give a little bit of context, because they tend to be railway hubs or important points on a railway line. It's not a huge area. And here, the resistance group Anti-Smersh set fire to a railway relay cabinet. So again, a key part of the system that controls train traffic. And if you can disable that equipment, as Anti-Smersh did here, then you also delay military supplies that are moving by rail in the south. Then on 7th of June in the town or small city of Azov in Rostov region inside Russia, the Mariupol resistance set fire at a drones part factory, obviously that supplies the Russian military, in order to disrupt production of drones that are used in attacks on Ukraine. And it's interesting that's in Rostov because the Russian occupation authorities, a lot of, I suppose, the bureaucracy or the administration is located in Rostov. So that's often where you are deported to, before you then go into the Russian prison system, if you're a pro-Ukrainian civilian. If you want to get things delivered to the occupied territories, especially to somewhere like Mariupol, as bizarre as this sounds, you can still sort of just send things to Rostov, and then from Rostov they can get into Mariupol. So Rostov is a sort of hub for the occupied territories, just for a bit of context, even though it's in Russia. On the 8th of June in Melitopol, which is, if you drove from Mariupol to Berdyansk, where the collaborator was killed, and then you continued driving for, again, about an hour, you would get to Melitopol along the sea. So in Melitopol, Zaporizhia region, there was local partisans started a fire at the Hydromash factory, which supports the Russian military with machinery, with repairs, etc. So again, kind of obvious why they would do that. Then on the 9th of June, we go on a trip to Tatarstan, to Kazan, the capital of Tatarstan. Very interesting city. What happened? Atesh resistance members, interesting given how many Crimean Tatars there are in the Atesh movement, that they should be active in Tatarstan. Atesh resistance members helped Ukrainian military intelligence, so WHO, coordinate an artillery strike on a gunpowder factory in Kazan, which again is very deep inside Russia, and the plant produces explosives. The factory produces explosives that are used by the Russian military. And I think we briefly spoke about Operation Pautina, Operation Spiderweb last time, but it's also, I think, noteworthy, I'll briefly interrupt myself here, that the key figure in making Spiderweb work was a member of the resistance from Donetsk region. He deliberately took a Russian passport in order to be able to do it. And all of the lorries and things like this were all registered to him, and he and his wife disappeared 3 days before. Sometimes people often ask, okay, but what is the point of all of this resistance? Well, there you are. Let Artyom from Donetsk be the final answer to this. The 10th of June, going back to the list, in Melitopol, Zaporizhia region, Atesh partisans carried out an attack on a vehicle that was carrying Russian drone operators, so targeted killing of Russian drone operators. Clearly, they're quite important for battlefield surveillance, targeting, etc. 11th of June, Novokakhovka, infamous from the destroyed dam, and also from when you had the collaborator governor Saldo standing in an office in Novokakhovka saying there was no flood or no danger, and then you could see the sort of the water about 5 meters high behind him. There was a sabotage operation in Novokakhovka, and it caused an explosion at a Russian military site, which is located near a very strategic river crossing that is used by Russian forces. So Novokakhovka is on the left bank, and obviously Kherson, the city which was under occupation until late September, October 2022, you want to stop the Russians crossing back over the river for obvious reasons. Again, in Melitopol district, so around the city, on the 12th of June, anti-Smer Shabak, they hit a Russian military cargo truck, destroyed it, and obviously it's focused on supply chains that were supposed to be supporting troops on the southern front. So we can see how much the resistance are playing a very important auxiliary role here in hampering Russian efforts to advance. On the 12th of June in Kalanchak, which is in Kherson region, in the occupied part of Kherson region on the left bank, anti-Smersh partisans set fire to a vehicle used by Russian military police. Who are the Russian military police? They are a force responsible for controlling and terrifying the local civilian population. On the 12th of June, which is Russia Day, a national holiday that's very complex, actually, and perhaps we can talk about it another time in terms of its symbolism. I think it's fair to say that most Russians don't necessarily have a real understanding of what the celebration is supposed to denote, but its origins are interesting, and in the Yeltsin era. The cyber resistance group Cyber Atesh, so Atesh is branching out, launched a cyber attack on Russian propaganda websites in order to disrupt pro-Kremlin messaging, and as part of a broader information war, of course, that we all know is going on. On 14th of June in Ramenskaya, Moscow region, resistance members from Mariupol Sprotiv sabotaged a section of railway infrastructure to delay military cargo trains that were travelling from Moscow towards the front line. On the 14th of June in Khabarovsk region, this is not an inclusion actually for the resistance, but it's an interesting example that I'm just going to discuss. So you had the Free Russia Legion, who are not the, shall we say, more nationalistically inclined ones, the RDK, who do a lot of the raids, but they are sort of more of a mixed bunch. And I know them well, actually, and I have an awful lot of respect for them, and they're probably some of the people I've had the best discussions and the most varied and open and constructive discussions about Russia and what different types of Russia could exist, to be blunt. But the Legion of Free Russia resistance damaged a military communication tower into Khabarovsk, which is very far east. So go to Siberia and then go a bit further east and you get to Khabarovsk. Khabarovsk also famously has quite an inclination towards protest. So they had huge protests, I think just before COVID, over the removal of a governor who wasn't even that popular. They just didn't like the way that he was removed. So they've got a bit of fire in them out in Khabarovsk. And these are part of sort of some of the guerrilla groups that are inside Russia linked to the Legion. And it's interesting, we're starting to see quite a lot of these groups, which most people understood did exist, but they hadn't sort of been activated. And I wonder to what extent that is just linked to the fact that there is no US support and like every little counts right now. On the 16th of June in Azovskia, which is in the occupied part of Kherson region, anti-Smersh fighters attacked a house that accommodates Russian soldiers and killed 3 occupiers. And then in Berdyansk, as mentioned at the start, we had the assassination, on the 18th of June, we had the assassination of Mikhailo Hritsai. I mean, yes, a collaborator, but I think it's fair to say a Russian agent of some long standing.
Well, Jade, thank you very much for the updates. You mentioned there the military police, the Russian military police in the occupied regions. And I know we were talking beforehand about the threat level for civilians and indeed for the resistance who are carrying out these activities. Could you just underscore that perhaps for us? Because it's very easy for us to talk about this and perhaps not talk about the severe consequences that people endure who are caught doing some of these activities.
There's a fair bit to say. I think one of the aspects to focus on is that a lot of the people engaged in these activities, they're civilians, or even if they are not, they are treated as civilians, which you might think is a leniency, but it's not, because civilians, they are just handed down either state treason, so gosizmena, or terrorism charges, so both of which are for at least 8 years in just the grimmest prisons imaginable. And since Russia classifies people on the occupied territories, indeed in territory not occupied by Russia, as Russians, these people just disappear and Ukraine is not able to get to them. Of course, that's if there's even a legal kind of approach. Often people are just tortured and disappear in torture chambers. In general, in the Soviet style, there is some sort of legalism, but you couldn't call it legal. It's a sort of pseudo-legalism, like the troiki of the period of the Great Terror, where you just had free people say, yeah, shoot him, or whatever. It's performative. There's no law in any recognizable sense in the occupied territories, but there's procedure sometimes. What happens in these prisons is unfortunately an area we don't know so much about, or we do, but it's clearly very, very hard to get in there. There are a lot of Ukrainians, or not a lot, but there are Ukrainians trying to identify who are the people who work there. In the same way, there are people trying very hard to identify who are the teachers who come from Russia to indoctrinate the children of Ukraine and prepare them to be soldiers. And I think it's really important that we have those names, because, some of the ongoing conversations about, Putin, everything's so focused on Putin, but ultimately this war only happens because teachers, just ordinary teachers, come to Ukraine to brainwash children, and because people work in prisons and torture people. We have to think about the darker side of humanity and the choices that those individuals have made that have led to this situation. So that's very broadly, there's not really very much that can be done, to be honest with you, for the Ukrainians, civilians who have been captured. And that's why there is really a focus on only doing, really violent, lethal operations if it's really needed, or if it's relatively risk-free. I'm stressing the word relatively there. And a lot of the focus is just on being eyes and ears and providing information to the Ukrainian armed forces. In general as well, there is a preference for people not to be involved in kind of performative sort of activist-y elements, because those people also get 8 years. That, the FSB just do not care whether or not you're doing violent or non-violent resistance. You're all terrorists and traitors to them. So there's also a preference, from those organizations involved on the Ukrainian side in resistance to discourage people from doing sort of showy acts of resistance that ultimately don't achieve anything. Tangible. They are good for morale, but yes. And I would also just like to draw attention to a campaign that's been launched in Ukrainian media that was launched by an individual who goes by the name of Skutny. So that means Eastern in Ukrainian. And he joined the resistance, I think, when he was about 16 in 2014 in Alchevsk in occupied Luhansk. And then, after a few years, he came over to free Ukraine, and now he fights in the Ukrainian armed forces. Clearly, he still does a lot in relation to the occupied territories, and he has launched a campaign about support and free the civil resistance, in the occupied territories. And although, as said, that won't do that much right now to help the individuals who are already in the prison system, it's really important, I think, to raise visibility about them, because there are so many people in the occupied territories who are just quietly, completely unassumingly going about their business and then providing coordinates to the Ukrainian armed forces. And it's really important, I think, that they just feel seen, that they feel recognized, that they know that people think about them, remember them. It's their choice to do that. We who live in free countries have, no right to expect anything of them. But if they choose to do that, then I think we can personally, out of just sheer respect, remember them and let them know that we're aware of that sacrifice and what that means. And we have a great deal of respect for their choice.
Thanks, Jade, as ever. Now, I'm delighted to have back safely in the studio Memphis Barker, who's just returned from his trip to Ukraine gathering stories for The Telegraph. Memphis, welcome home. We last heard from you when you were discussing your story about the impact of strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and you teased a story about soldiers who'd gone AWOL but since returned to the army. What did you discover?
Well, I'll take you to Kyiv when we last spoke. Maybe the next day after that. We travelled to the office of a recruiter for one of Ukraine's top battalions. As we were speaking, he brought out his phone and he says, on my phone, I have 1 million chats open with various soldiers who've gone AWOL from the battlefield. In my head, before I started reporting the story, my impression was if you desert or if you go AWOL from a base, you're going to face a pretty serious punishment. Up until September last year, that was the case in Ukraine. I mean, in the early years of the war, people were getting 6 years for going AWOL, punishment for desertion on the battlefield, which Ukraine takes more seriously, up to 12 years. But, as we've all been made aware of in the last year, the pressures on Ukraine's resources of manpower are huge, and the number of Ukrainian soldiers who are going AWOL or deserting is also, apparently very high. In some units, people speak of a figure as high as 20%, and in others, it's going to be much lower than that, depending on the quality. According to Ukraine's Prosecutor's General Office, something like 100,000 cases of absconsion have been recorded since the beginning of the year. Now, more than 2/3 of those were last year, again, pointing to the fatigue and the extraordinary pressures on the front. So, Ukraine's parliament decided we're going to make a law which says if you agree to rejoin the army, whether you deserted, whether you went AWOL, you'll be allowed back in with no punishment. And the system through which that happens is kind of interesting in the sense that these soldiers, either they get picked up or they present themselves to authorities, and then they get held in reserve battalions. And in these reserve battalions, you have a lot of men waiting to go back to the front, and they're also being visited by recruiters who need men. And so, like the guy we met, they will speak to the AWOL soldiers, they'll try and weigh them up, get a sense of why they left, get a sense of what kind of man they are. This guy we spoke to called Roman, he said he was... He'd asked them, have you had any trouble with the law? Have you got any STIs? Have you got any heart problems? And, he's thinking, as he's looking at them, would I be comfortable fighting with this man on the front line again? Roman, the recruiter, had been in Bakhmut. He was a combat medic. The stories he was telling us about his time there were, eye-opening, doesn't even begin to cover it. He said he was just constantly pounded by artillery, planes, assaults. And in the last assault... he went on before the withdrawal from Bakhmut. He was the only man of 20 not to be killed or wounded, and his brother was among the victims. So he said basically after that, his brain sort of broke for a bit, and he's been sent, away from the front to recover. He will have to go back, so that's partly why he's looking at these men in a very kind of careful way. And, from this meeting, we spoke to one of the AWOL soldiers, or formerly AWOL soldiers, I should say, who he was trying to bring in to his battalion. This was a young man called Vladimir, 23, very, very young, and had signed up for the war in the early days. This guy, by no means a coward. I think or what we would describe as one, certainly in historical terms. He'd been thrust into the front around in the Donetsk region, let's say. He had trained as a drone pilot, a reconnaissance drone pilot. Those troops are usually held slightly further back from the contact line, and obviously it's a very sought-after specialism at this point in time. His commander had essentially lost a lot of men, whether some through going AWOL, some through obviously being killed or wounded on the front. He said to this young man, right, you're in the infantry now. And, lots of soldiers are relatively skinny, but Vladimir is a thin young man, doesn't look like your kind of typical grunt. He looks much more like a drone pilot. And so Vova, as he's known, was on his second very poorly planned mission, where he was told he was going to be 750 meters from the Russian lines. There's going to be lots of Ukrainian defenses around him. The armoured vehicle drops him off. They're 100 meters from the Russians. They're under heavy fire immediately, and there's no form of support. He flees to a nearby house, bombarded for 12 hours. Drones, artillery, mortars. He thought he was going to die. He says, I realised I wasn't going to survive a third operation like that. So he says to his commander, listen, this was only late last year, around the time of the passage of the law. He says, if you don't transfer me to another brigade, I'm going to go AWOL myself. The commander refuses. He walks away. He's aware again, I think around this time the law has passed, that if he goes back in to present himself to the authorities, he will then be able to transfer. It's essentially a kind of slightly rougher method of switching from a weak battalion to a strong battalion. So he goes straight back into the authorities and says, here I am. And that's when he starts being approached by men like Roman, who look at him and they say, oh, you're a trained drone pilot. We could use you. It's almost like a kind of transfer market to, in some weird ways. Other recruiters are trying much the same thing. The 47th Brigade have put out a specific kind of advertisement. The Azov 12th, another hugely respected formation, are kind of competing for the attention of these absconders. I spoke to a kind of analyst, Gil Barndollar, who was like, well, there's going to be an element of natural selection as a result of this law, that some of these brigades that are perhaps not fighting with the same level of appreciation of drone warfare, maybe their tactics aren't as formidable as others, maybe they don't have enough weaponry, you might see those brigades start to shrivel and others start to grow. But again, it's early days, and since it's been about 7-8 months since the passage of the law. What is interesting, I suppose, is that the extension for these AWOL soldiers and deserters to return keeps being extended because Ukraine simply cannot afford to jail, to punish these men. It needs as many as possible of them to come back into the armed forces and to go back into the fight with Putin.
Well, thanks very much, Memphis. It's a really, really fascinating piece, which, of course, we'll link to in the show notes. We know that there are many more stories to come from you. We've just wanted to stagger them so that we can do justice to each one you're currently writing up. But I have to briefly ask you about your recent trip to the front lines. Where did you go?
So we went to a village 4 or 5 kilometres from Pokrovsk, and that is within the drone umbrella, which can go anywhere 20 kilometres back from the contact line, from the zero line. But again, the kind of closer you get, the more nerve-wracking, frankly, it is. I mean, we were going in with this extraordinarily brave team of electricians who fix the power cables for people who are too poor, really, to leave their homes in and around the front line. I mean, staggeringly, there are something like 1,000 people left in Pokrovsk. In this village, there were some 300. They had no power. They couldn't get any water because they couldn't pump the well. These cities are under basically constant bombardment. Vitaly, the chief engineer who took us with him, saying that, he was a Pokrovsk local. He's like, you go there, in that city, it just stinks of death, he says. And the one in the village we visited, it's very sad. You see a kind of graveyard to one side of the road, lots of makeshift graves. You can't get the ambulance workers, you can't get the undertakers to come in. And, certainly for me, going in was even getting to that point was nerve-wracking. You've got the beeping of a drone monitor telling you how close the Russian surveillance sort of drones are, because they're ever present in the skies above you. And at one point we're driving in, Vitaly says, well, there's a surveillance drone following us, it's 400 metres away. If this beeps start getting any more regular, we may have to, jump out of the car. And he works in those conditions. They don't go out every day to do a job, but they go out, 2-3 times a week. The last one they went on, too much Russian shelling, they had to get out of there very quickly. We went into this village, and as they're working, they're restringing the wire between the pylons. You hear, several rounds of outgoing fire. I think it's a howitzer and a tank, and then several HIMARS, which he's very good at identifying. All these sounds he's hearing. I'm not an experienced war correspondent. I've no sense of what they could be, but he knew each one by one. And then obviously 15 minutes later, as we were warned, the Russian return fire comes in, and it's guided bombs. And he's asking his friend on top of the electricity pylon, saying, can you see the clouds? How far away are they? How far away are they? And, fortunately, it's about 2 kilometres. But for me, certainly, that was enough of a close enough brush. We went and did a couple of other bits, and then we got out of there at that point. But, as I say, we got out of there. This is their job. And to do it takes reserves of courage. So I think it's just extraordinary to witness. They wear body armour, they wear helmets, their car's got shrapnel in it. Several of their staff members have been injured, and they're just partly relying, I think, on the fact that their car can be seen by these surveillance drones, but it's not a high-value target, right? They're also being watched going in and out of this front line fairly regularly, so you sort of take your chances with that and think, well, even their artillery is not going to be aiming at us. It might be aiming at some of these nearby systems, but we'll take our chances there. But just, he said, overall, and the point I'll be writing up in the piece is just the drone situation has just radically transformed. And even as an electrician, they're now all watching the skies. You're now all holding drone monitors. Your threat picture has radically transformed, and we're now driving under net corridors, driving through drone netting even to get to these villages on the front, all of which is relatively new, all of which is being struck by the Russians day in, day out at this point.
Well, thank you very much, Memphis, for your reporting. I'll come to you for your final thoughts later on. But first, to conclude the week, we're going to play Dom's panel at the Black Sea Security Forum in Odesa, where he interviews Sir Ben Wallace, Britain's Defence Secretary for the majority of the war, and former Minister of State for Security, Tom Tugendhat.
We've got half an hour, we've got a lot to get through. I'm going to make most of the opportunity, so I'm going to start straight away, if that's okay. Tom Tugendhat, Conservative MP, former Security Minister. There's an opportunity right now. The US administration seems to be slightly disengaged, shall we say, or playing the long game with Ukraine. There's an opportunity here for Britain to take a lead in this coalition of the willing or unwilling, or coalition of the willing to do what, we don't know. But there's a slight opportunity here. I was intrigued, therefore, that on Sky News, your party leader, Kemi Badenoch, said that Ukraine is fighting a proxy war on behalf of Western Europe against Russia. Do you think she was wise to use such incautious language, and do you think this is a proxy war?
What I think this is a defence for the liberty of the Ukrainian people. And I think it's an incredibly important fight, which is why I'm very proud that Ben and others in the government at the time were incredibly quick, making sure we got the arms and ammunition into the support of those early days in 2022, and why what we've seen really for the last 2-3 years is pretty much universal support in the United Kingdom for Ukraine. There is no genuine political division on the support for Ukraine. It's pretty much 100%.
And Kemi Badenoch's comments?
I'd leave other people to speak for themselves. I'm glad I'm not in the shadow cabinet. I don't have to answer for it.
Well, you're very lucky we've only got half an hour, so we will move on. So, Ben, the EU has made a bold step into the world of Black Sea security. EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs Keir Callas said about a new three-pronged approach to Black Sea security. There's going to be a multi-billion euro splurge on infrastructure, on ports and roads and rail in Central and Eastern Europe to reinforce the front, she said, quicker. There's also going to be a load of trade with the Caucasus and Asia. But the most interesting thing I thought was this Black Sea maritime security hub that's going to be set up somewhere in a city fairly near here, I'm led to believe. Do you think it's helpful, Sir Ben, that the EU is making such a bold move into the arena of Black Sea security? Or, given one of the big players is Turkey, not in the EU, but in NATO, is it unhelpful for the EU to park what few tanks they have on NATO's lawn?
No, I don't think so. Remember, we've got to keep on board both Romania and Bulgaria and these other members of the European Union. They've got to feel that they are part of the benefits of a secure and stable Ukraine. And it's really important that Ukraine can continue to grow its economy by getting out of its country, its grain and its corn, its agriculture, etc. And I think it's very important, therefore, that the EU takes a role in the security of the Black Sea. But of course, as your earlier contributor said in the previous session, you have to bring Turkey along, whether you're doing it in the name of the EU, of NATO or whatever. You know, they consider the Black Sea predominantly as their territory, their backyard. There are big stakeholders in it. It needs to be done in cooperation, not in confrontation. But I think it's important. I don't think we should worry about it. We should be encouraged by it. But ultimately, we've got to see how it can be delivered in practice, because very early on, the United Kingdom, as far back as 2014, set up a group of Navy personnel in Ukraine to help them with capacity building. I remember going to Mariupol myself before the invasion to visit it. And I think we need to make sure that we actually turn it into action rather than just lots of announcements.
Thank you. I'll ask you to comment in a moment, if I may, Tom. Before I forget, though, Sir Ben, I put a little note on my card here. I've realised that it's a picture of a gun. I thought it was something I'd squashed earlier. I was with an air defence unit last night, about an hour outside of Odesa. I won't say in which direction or where we were or what they were protecting, but the people there who were very professional, the team of air defenders, when they heard what I was doing, what I was up to, they wanted me to pass on their personal thanks to you for what you did whilst you were in office in getting the weapons, and in particular the tanks, breaking the tank taboo when you sent the Challengers, and that sort of unlocked Abrams. So they wanted to pass on their thanks. That's the only free pass you're getting from me in the next half hour.
There should be more to come. And what I would say is there's a lesson coming out of the White House, which is when Donald Trump talked about switching off our intelligence, or the intelligence, what I think he didn't really realize in today's world, a generation of intelligence is not the sole state monopoly of the United States. And it was very, very apparent that with a little bit of effort and work, I got alongside. Within 24 hours, we managed to basically switch on commercial intelligence back and made the difference. So I think that's something that we should notice, that there's still, the support can't be one-off, it has to continue.
Interesting, you're still very active on the world stage in this regard. That was one of my last questions, which I will come back to later. But Tom, just on the EU, can it be an overcrowded market, the provision of security in the EU regarding the Black Sea?
No, it can't. The reality is every country in, I was going to say Eastern Europe, but actually, let's be honest, in Europe is threatened by Russia in different ways. You'll remember the Skripal's attack in the United Kingdom, in Salisbury, the attack on Litvinenko, and many others besides. The reality is Russia is exporting violence to everyone. Ukraine happens to be on the front line today. It is absolutely right we support Ukraine, but it's also right that we help others who realize that threats in the Black Sea, threats in their region like Poland or the Baltic states, get the support they need. And that's why turning this from just a Ukrainian operation to a European and a full NATO support operation is so important. No, it's not a NATO operation in the traditional sense, but deploying the resources of NATO partners, individually, yes, but together, makes it incredibly important.
And we have the Strategic Defence Review that's been limping towards the finish line for the last few months. Are you expecting, both of you, please, Sir Ben, first of all, are you expecting there to be any firm commitments, if not for Ukraine and the Black Sea security directly, but enough hints about the kind of priorities that this new government feels it should invest in defence terms, that is a very obvious nod to the newly revealed threat from Russia and the need to bolster the Black Sea security?
I mean, I think, sadly, we won't really know the full shape of this review till December. This first part of the review is a sort of think piece narrative without any detailed money attached or any detailed programs and equipment programs, which will apparently come later in the autumn around a sort of comprehensive spending review stroke budget. So it's quite hard to know what will be waffle and what will be a concrete proposal to change our defence. So far, the track record hasn't been brilliant, but I'm willing it to give it a fair wind. But ultimately, what we've got to make sure is that the lessons of Ukraine are reported fully into our military, and that our military chiefs have the confidence to close off what is starting to become outdated capability and replace it with new capability that will enable us to help Ukraine even more. And I'll reserve judgment until I see I think it's a 120-page document that's about to be published. And then I also reserve it till I see what the Treasury actually says, as opposed to the spin.
And oh my goodness, you've exploded on the screen behind me. It's like, crikey, we're looming over us like Big Brother.
I'd
Tom,
like to be Big Brother.
That's an important point about the Treasury, isn't it, Tom? Because the current government, obviously not your party, but the current government has committed to reaching 2.5% of GDP spent on defence in the UK. However, the message very strongly, very, very strongly from a number of places I've spoken to, is that in the NATO conference next month in The Hague, 25th, 26th of next month, the call is going to be 5%, 3.5% on hard metal, and 1.5% on what was described as additional defence spending, i.e. infrastructure. But yeah, all necessary stuff, security and intelligence. So if there is this opportunity now for Britain to show some leadership in this coalition of the willing or the future emerging security architecture in Europe, can Britain go to 5%?
Yeah, look, Britain not only can, it must, when you include all of that. Because the reality is, when you look at our intelligence spend, when you look at the various other elements that we're spending on, we simply don't have a choice as to protecting ourselves. This isn't some sort of vanity project. This isn't about some sort of ego trip for defence manufacturers. This is about keeping Britain and our allies safe. And to Ben's point about the defence spending question, this will be my 5th SDR of various kinds. My first ones were when I was the military assistant to the Chief of the Defence Staff. And all I can say is I've read a lot of nice words. I've also seen budgets shrunk. And the hardest thing that we've got to do is to make some real choices, because the real choices are, what kind of a defence force are you trying to build? Are you trying to build the kind of defence force that was quite useful in the 1980s? Or are you trying to build a kind of defence force that Ukraine has shown is absolutely essential in 2025? Now, I think we need to be investing here. We need to be making sure we're learning off Estonia's cyber capabilities. We're learning off Ukrainian tech capabilities. There's a huge amount that we should be learning off our partners. So this isn't just about money. This is about some really serious strategic choices. And at the moment, I wait to be better informed when this document is published, but at the moment there's no obvious determination to make those difficult choices.
On difficult choices and obvious determination, Ben, Kai Kallas, as I say, outlined the new EU Black Sea security mechanism. But Friedrich Merz, new Chancellor of Germany, he was talking about Taurus, the cruise missiles, and he was asked whether Taurus would now be on the way to Ukraine, and he said it was within the realm of possibility. Not a very equivocal answer. Why do you think he couldn't just say yes? And would you like to have heard him just say yes?
Well, look, in opposition, or when he was in the run to the Chancellor, he said yes. And one of my strong criticisms of his predecessor was he didn't have any concept of how deterrence works. Sometimes it's important to be ambiguous, actually, and to link what you do with behaviour. So I used to always link more weapons to Ukraine or upgrading what we were putting in to Putin's behaviour. When the very first time he started hitting civilian areas of Ukraine, I put in the Starstreak anti-aircraft missile so that there was a response to his behaviour. But what I never did was rule anything out. Olaf Scholz constantly ruled things out, which obviously helped Putin in every way possible. I will not put Taurus in. Brilliant. Putin loved that. So, no, I think the new Chancellor is probably trying to navigate a coalition. Remember, he's got the SPD still in it. He does want to put it in, and I think the international community needs to keep reassuring Germany that it won't be as escalatory as the opponents say. The very first time I put in Stork Shadow, in fact, authorised its use, we didn't make a big deal of it. It just arrived one morning quite early in an airbase, if I remember rightly, in a Russian airbase, and then they realised what was happening. So I think be a bit...
It just arrived.
Well, with a bang. But I think the reality is, I don't think he has anything to fear. We belong to a big alliance. Russia has constantly ignored all rules of war, and for every action there must be a reaction. And I would say to him, he has my support. I think he wants to do it, and we should do it sooner rather than later so that Putin can't exploit the time. But being ambiguous is part of deterrence.
And Tom, isn't that the point, that Taurus is now no longer just a weapon? It is a metaphor for political will and support. So let's say if Germany sends 2, 5, 10, I've absolutely no idea of the numbers, but it almost doesn't matter. It's the direction of travel of this new Germany, biggest economy in Europe, right at the centre of all these defence and security issues that are coming to the fore. Is Taurus now beyond just a mere weapon?
Look, I agree with Ben. I would like to see Friedrich Merz delivering it and making that long speech that was given at the Zeitenwende speech become reality, because we heard Germany, rather like those SDRs I was talking about, using all the words but making none of the actions. Well, now Germany has, I think, got a leader that really understands the threat that Germany is under, and you've got a government in Poland that is investing because they understand. You've got a whole series of European states who truly understand the threat that we are all dealing with. And so I think this isn't like 2 or 3 years ago when Ben and a few others were alone in making sure that we were able to do the things we were able to do. And in fact, Germany refused us overflight rights for some of the missiles that we were trying to get in. This is now a different Europe, and I'm very glad that Merz is talking about it. Let's hope he can get his coalition over the line on it, because it's absolutely essential, not just for Ukraine and not just for the UK, but for Germany too.
Ben, the next big event, other than dinner tonight, of course, is these quote-unquote peace negotiations, in lots of inverted commas, because I don't think there's much will on Russia's behalf to negotiate any kind of meaningful peace. What do you see as the best possible outcome and the worst? And then finally, the most realistic is that we should expect?
Well, I think what we need to try and reverse is what happened literally on day one of the US administration, which was Donald Trump's messaging gave hope to Putin. And a large part of this dreadful war has actually been a battle of resolve and a battle of hope. And at the beginning, so many people underestimated Ukraine. So many people didn't think it would survive long, wouldn't be able to defeat this massive Russian army. And every stage, people underestimated the Ukrainians. And it was always my mission in my department at the time to say, we've got to give Ukrainians hope that they can defend themselves, and hope that the international community will stay with them. Now, when Donald Trump arrived at the White House on day one of his new administration, by setting out all those conditions that really met Putin's ambitions, he sacked away hope from Ukraine and gave it to Putin, who, as we know, is a man who would say to himself, well, goody, I just need to lose another million of my own people, but I'll get what I want in the end. So I hope that these peace negotiations, every time Russia is exposed as basically being fake at these meetings, which we all know they are, or indeed just refusing, that what happens is the United States' language changes and we return that hope back to the international community in Ukraine that there is going to be a response and we're not going anywhere. If we can do that, then I think Putin will actually maybe finally get the message that he has to make concessions and that he's actually not on the winning ticket. But at the moment, he will feel a little bit he is because of the language of the White House. I think we can reverse that. But the best way to do that is actions, not words.
Tom, same question. Best, worst, most realistic outcome? Because, of course, we saw how Russia will try and do anything not to get to negotiations. We heard those comments from Sergei Lavrov. So when the Pope offered to host peace negotiations, Lavrov said the Pope would be uncomfortable hosting Ukraine and Russia because they are Orthodox.
The Ukrainians are, of course, in communion with the Catholic Church, but Lavrov is denying that because he claims the whole of the Russian sphere of influence, as he calls it, but independent countries.
But yet another way of saying we'd love to turn up to these peace negotiations, but we don't want the Pope to be uncomfortable. The Pope looks supremely
you know that Lavrov is lying when his lips move. This is a guy who cannot sit straight for being dishonest. He has been so serially dishonest for his entire life that he's completely irrelevant to any negotiation, except for the fact that Putin sends him out as some dog to be kicked. Well, some dog. He's just a poodle. Ignore him. The reality is what Putin wants is he wants the peace of the grave. That's all he wants. He wants either to repeat Bucha and Irpin again, but over the whole of Ukraine, and he's quite willing to see millions of his own young people, mostly from those poorer eastern areas of Russia, be murdered. He's perfectly happy to see the entire destruction of many people in Russia in order to achieve it. What we need to do is make sure that he realizes, and more importantly, those around him realize, that that's not going to work. Now, we have a very simple choice in these talks. Do we stand up for countries that are standing for freedom? Or do we bow to a dictator whose appetite will only grow the more he eats? I think it's a very simple answer. We know what's going to happen in these negotiations. There's no surprise. There's absolutely no doubt. They're going to be a complete joke and a total waste of time. But we've got to do it to make sure that everybody sees that Ukraine has tried everything possible. And that's why I support President Zelensky completely in going to these talks. But I also support all of those like Merz and us who are doing everything we can to make sure that those talks don't result in the disarming of Ukraine.
We're coming to the end now, folks, but I can't let these two go without just a little bit of domestic UK politics. Tom, I've still got the hat. I've still got the I'm a Tugendhat baseball cap you gave me for when you were running for leadership of the Conservative Party. Do I need to hang on to it? Is there any more political ambition there?
No, you don't. You need to be very conscious that what we're going through in the UK is a moment of some really serious turmoil. And there are many reasons for it, but one of them is to do with the way that the economics of the UK are currently working and the unfairness between different communities and different groups who feel left out. But the answer to that is to support Kemi and to make sure we have the proper opposition that is going to challenge this government. Because the truth is this government is an utter failure on so many areas. I hope they're not going to be a failure on defence. They've been absolutely right on Ukraine. And what Kemi is doing exactly the right thing. So I am fully supporting Kemi.
Thank you. Put that down as a maybe. Now, Ben, you are looming over this stage here in Odessa. Do you seek to loom over any world stages again in the future? Where are we next going to see you pop up?
I wish that I was looming over the Kremlin right now and being able to reach down out of the sky and pluck Mr. Putin out and drop him into the river or something. Because I think ultimately, unlike Tom, who, is still a Conservative MP in the House of Commons, and like him, I'll be, of course, supportive of my leadership, whoever that may be. I am now a bystander of the political circus that goes on in Parliament. But for me, I will carry on doing what I can globally to support Ukraine. And I now invest in defence and security technologies, and I often meet Ukrainians who are trying to get their ideas out in investments in technology, and at the same time trying to work internally of our ministry and our military to get them to recognise that Ukraine is the teacher now, right? That the lessons, sadly, forced lessons by Putin, that it's not some abstract place far away. If we are going to be fit to deter Russia and fight tomorrow's wars, we have to learn from Ukraine now. We have to learn about their technology. We have to develop their technology jointly. We have to work with each other. And if, as some of our more institutionalized military leaders will prefer, it will be cast as, oh no, we do it differently. Of course, we do it very differently. They are going to just re-equip for yesterday's wars with equipment that looks like the army I served in the end of the early 90s. So I think we keep banging that drum is what I do. I'm off to Washington. I might not get past the yellow line, Homeland Security, but ultimately I think we have to keep on championing Ukraine and the cause of Ukraine wherever we go. So that takes a lot of my time. So I'll leave domestic politics to Tom and his friends.
The last thing I'd say is we have seen the evil spread of Russian corruption throughout Europe. One of the first things I did when chairing the Foreign Affairs Committee was calling it out. That is on all of us, because the truth is Russia's and Putin's poisonous influence across the whole world isn't just military, it isn't just intelligence, it's also the corruption of awful businesses that are deliberately undermining us. So we need to stand strong on so many areas. And what Ben is doing is fantastically important, making the case consistently that Russia is evil, that what they're doing is evil. And the only regime change I want to see is in Moscow.
Well, thank you both very much indeed for joining us. That was a brief view from the UK. Thank you very much to Tom Tugendhat, current serving Conservative MP, and to Ben Wallace, former British Defence Secretary. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Let's go to our final thoughts. Are there any final thoughts that you want to leave us with, Memphis? Now you're back from Ukraine.
Well, I mean, you're saying, you mentioned the strikes on Odessa. I was travelling around with our brilliant fixer, Viktor Sajenko, is an Odessa local, and I get a text from him this morning going, the strikes knocked some of my kitchen equipment off my table. It's so close to him. He's very often things can go off around him. He's not a heavy sleeper. But he said this time, for someone who's accustomed to the sights and sounds of war at this point, is still a little shaken, if joking that he needs a better alarm clock. I think having been, certainly for my first time, and you guys are in and out, really regularly, and I think that putting the real people, kind of coming to understand them as human beings, as friends, it transforms, your appreciation for the country and its struggle. It's no longer just a word on a page for me, Odessa. It's no longer Victor. It's no longer just another person who's quoted in a news article. I know maybe it would sound obvious, but the emotional impact on myself, certainly as a reporter, is strong, to say the least.
Thanks, Memphis. We leave you with a short clip today from another Telegraph podcast, The Daily Tea, which features a fascinating conversation between its host, Camilla Tominey, former Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Nick Carter, our Defence and Foreign Affairs Editor, Con Coughlin, and former British Foreign Secretary Sir Jeremy Hunt, whose warning you're about to hear. We'll link to it in the show notes.
The risk we have is that we underestimate the danger we have. And I'm going to say this very starkly, and I'll be very interested whether Nick and Con think I'm exaggerating to say this, but I just want to say this. If Ukraine ends up in something that Putin can call a victory, and China decides to make a grab for Taiwan, we are potentially in a situation where we have conflict in Europe and in Asia at the same time, which would previously be defined as a world war. And I think we have an axis now of authoritarian states who really do believe their system is better. And this very much reminds me of the 1970s and 80s I grew up in with the Soviet Union, when there was this feeling that we couldn't take the future of open societies and democracies for granted. And I think we are on the cusp of something similar. I'm not saying this is the most likely outcome, but I think we have to have our eyes open.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.